Hey everybody, I'm Josh with DAOstack, and I'm here with Jordan Greenhall. Jordan is a member of the DAOstack advisory team, as well as formerly co-founder and CEO at Divx, co-founder at mp3.com. And Jordan is one of the leaders of the movement known as Deep Code, which contemplates, among other things, some of the great challenges facing humanity and what it will take to solve them through the combined lens of a wide variety of disciplines. You can read some of Jordan's work on the Medium publication Deep Code. I particularly recommend the Situational Assessment series. So, Jordan, what are you observing in the ecosystem of humanity that suggests a need for a project like DAOstack, and how do you see DAOstack supporting the shifts that need to occur?
I think the first thing is to kind of caveat that there's many different things that are going on, and lots of them are interesting. So what I'm about to say isn't necessarily the only or even the most interesting aspect, but I think it's one that isn't common knowledge, and I think it's a very powerful concept that drives anybody who grasps it fully. I think will have a meaningful upgrade in their ability to perceive what's going on and make good choices. So the idea here is that the concept of rivalrous and anti-rivalrous is just called economics.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept is actually pretty simple, and these days it's actually pretty easy to grasp, which is the rivalrous consists of the production and distribution of things like a ham sandwich or a glass of water or a barrel of oil, meaning the kinds of things where if I have it, you don't have it, and if I use it, it's gone forever, meaning that we can be rivals over its possession. And I think it's fair to say that effectively all of economics and all of the economy for effectively all of civilization has been driven by the question of how do we most effectively produce and most effectively distribute rivalrous goods, and the kind of the playing off between production and distribution, I think in many ways can just compactly describe the tensions between various economic theories in the past, or at least political economic theories. And in the field of economics, there's room for a concept called the non-rivalrous, which I think is actually a pretty sloppy idea. It's like a park or a bus where many people can share it. These are shareables, and those are interesting. But I think if you really push them to the limit, they collapse back down to the rivalrous. It's just larger groups of people are associated with them. But then there's a completely different concept, which is the anti-rivalrous.
Yep.
And these are things that those of us who spend a lot of time in the digital sphere or in the information sphere have intimate familiarity with. These are things like, say, calculus or the English language, or both the idea and the active practice of the blockchain. These are things where not only can I have it and then also you having it without me losing anything, but more importantly, actually, it becomes more valuable the more people who have it. Right. So it's subject to almost inverse logics, almost inverse dynamics. And as it turns out, as a consequence, also completely different economics. The kind of economics, even simple things like the law of supply and demand, just flat out don't apply and can't help make sense of the anti-rivalrous domain. Right? So those are two fundamental concepts. And then the next big piece, of course, is to recognize that we are moving into an environment where the anti-rivalrous increasingly is dominant. Moving out of a space where scarcity and rivalrous goods are effectively everything you have to care about, and into a domain where designing systems that are optimized for the generation and distribution of anti-rivalrous phenomena are what matters. We could just kind of make it prosaic, which is to say, think about the way that technology has grasped and taken complete responsibility for, or is in the process of taking responsibility for, say, food production. If we move into the zone of vertical indoor farming and cultured meats, like imagine in 10 years, 85% of all food is actually produced by those kinds of modes. That takes a fundamentally rivalrous phenomenon, food, almost in some sense the archetype, and shows how it has become the object and consequence of the anti-rivalrous rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So the DAO as a concept, in many ways, takes place in the context of the necessity for the invention and development of a truly anti-rivalrous economic system, both at a conceptual level and at a physical level. So while it is certainly the case, and I completely endorse notions of thinking about, and by the way, even spent a lot of time thinking about notions about how the DAO revolutionizes methods of organization and does things like reduces transaction costs. I think it's actually more interesting, more profound, more powerful to think about how the DAO steps into the space of the anti-rivalrous.
Yep.
And what does that mean? So then to kind of examine that, we can take a look at the problem of open source. And open source is actually maybe what's the right way of putting it? It's an early stage of this evolution. It's a recognition of the fact that there's something incredibly powerful about the ability to create things that are more valuable the more shared they are, and therefore we should design them to be more shared, and we should open the source and make it so that anybody who wants to use them can, and equivalently anybody who wants to add value to them can, because the multiplicative factor is enormous. But of course, what open source lacks is a mechanism for two distinct things. One is rewarding people for doing that in any way other than intrinsic, which is great. I mean, don't get me wrong, the open source envelope has done an enormous amount of good, but it's in many ways reached its limitations. There are things that it has not been able to do.
Yep.
And a part of why it hasn't been able to do them is because you can't make a meaningful living in the open source world.
Right.
At least large amounts of people can't. And in particular, the most brilliant people aren't well rewarded for contributing their brilliance to this open commons. And this is solving this problem is one of the things that the DAO, or in this case, quite specifically DAOstack in particular, is positioned to do.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, the other major problem happens to be the other side of the same coin, which is how do we go about orienting ourselves towards the highest kind of value that we could contribute into this anti-rivalrous domain. And if you think about old-fashioned microeconomics, it's just supply and demand, which shows up as price, meaning if I have skills at growing food and I have skills at fixing cars and I have skills at repairing shoes, the easy way for me to find out which of those I should do is to find out which one will pay me the most. Right? That's kind of the brilliance of the price equation in a market economy.
Yes.
All I have to do is keep my eyes open for what is paying me the most, and that is what is in fact the most valuable way that I can contribute to the commons. But and what we try to do is we try to kind of shoehorn the anti-rivalrous into that environment by inventing intellectual property. So if I can take the output of my anti-rivalrous goods, ideas, and I can put a fence around them and say, okay, no, these are now rivalrous, you can kind of make them a little bit work using supply and demand. But of course, the whole point is that what patents and trademarks and copyright do is they limit shareability. So what they actually do is they limit the global value that could be produced. And if you think about the way that it's not just a one-time, meaning lots of people can benefit from the sharing, but it's also the shape of the curve, because the anti-rivalrous has this building on the shoulders of giants. Somebody invents calculus. Not only is it great that everybody gets calculus, but it's also the fact that nobody else has to ever do it again. Right. So the next genius doesn't have to reinvent calculus. The next genius gets to build what's on top of calculus and continue. So if you rate limit the dissemination of anti-rivalrous phenomena, not only do you limit the value of their dissemination on one level, but more importantly, you actually change the slope of the curve of what happens when people get this ramifying effect of building on the shoulders of giants. And so if you basically run the math on that, the patent style system, which is to say the rivalrous approach to anti-rivalrous phenomena, is extraordinarily impoverishing and also effectively hobbles or destroys the actual generative capacity of those economies that operate in that fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is actually very important. What that means is that anybody, or more specifically, the first group, the first economy of any meaningful size that figures out how to actually fully orient optimal attention to the most valuable anti-rivalrous contributions, and then to motivate them by fully incentivizing them,
Mm-hmm.
has a decisive strategic advantage over all rivalrous economies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
this is it's a one-way trip. It is the metaphorical equivalent of learning of Homo sapiens learning how to speak versus other primates. It is that level of dissemination. It is a escape velocity shift. And
Yes.
so it is both it is a novel problem, it is a hard problem, and it is a good problem. If you solve that problem, you have in many ways won the entirety of the rivalrous game, the game that civilization has been playing for the past 10,000 years. You get to win that game, and then you get to play in a completely new game. And because of the velocity, the shape of the curve that happens when you've begun to resolve the anti-rivalrous questions. And again, it's the question of where should I, as a potential contributor to the anti-rivalrous economy, most fully attend? Where's my genius most fully best applied for the acceleration of the whole? And then also, how does the whole most appropriately and effectively reward me for doing that so that I am fully and appropriately incentivized? Right? That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The acceleration of that problem is what moves us into what many people call the society of abundance. It
Mm-hmm.
moves us into, I think probably the best statement so far is from the book Mana.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the Australia Project. The Australia Project is exactly this, or at least it's close enough to count. So we can kind of just to recapitulate. We have the problem that we can't actually use supply and demand in the price equation either to orient people's attention or to reward their contributions in the anti-rivalrous domain. I can spend time kind of decomposing that, but in this context, for the moment, let's just accept that as being an insight. And if we can figure out how to solve that problem appropriately to the anti-rivalrous domain, we've done something that is just flat out more than a good idea. It is qualitative shift in group capacity. So this then becomes the object that attracted me to this space, and it is also actually the object that attracted Matan to this space. And the reason why I spent my time, energy, and money supporting what Matan was doing was because he and the kind of people who get what he's trying to do, which is to say the community that intrinsically begins to gather around that project, initially in Backfeed and then more concretely in DAOstack, are the kinds of minds with the kinds of attitude, approaches, and backgrounds that could solve this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting, actually, because when I said that, I was initially thinking was it might be important to think about the way that you could solve the problem in principle, meaning you could craft a theory about how one goes about doing this, a new model of economics, or you could solve it in practice. You could craft an architecture, a technical architecture. As it turns out, they're exactly the same.
Right.
Oddly enough, and this is actually also ends up being a kind of a profound concept that somebody might be moved to explore. In the world that we're operating in, there is in many ways no distinction between theory and practice.
Mm-hmm.
Or rather, they're glued together in such an intimate way that while one can and should think about, say, the design aspect of practice and the coding aspect of theory, so I inverted them on purpose, that's the better way of thinking about it. Meaning, kind of like the way in the scientific endeavor, theory and experiment can be separated, but one is only doing science when one is doing both in a very intimate way. In this case of the anti-rivalrous and all problems of its sort, by the way, there's many, one must simultaneously be doing writing code and thinking in how it's actually implemented in, call it physical architecture, and doing high-level design. You have to be doing both, and that I think is what makes DAOstack interesting. Is that they I think, intuitively get that, but more importantly, have the capacity to do it.
Yeah.
And this is very different than a lot of the native ways that one goes about doing software development in this millennium. For very good reasons, by the way. Software development in the 21st century has taken a very incremental and low architecture approach. Speed and the ability to simply change things rapidly has become a good design methodology. And in many cases, that's a good idea. But in certain cases, it's completely incapable of solving the problem. And I think we have a nice, simple example, which was the transition to Ethereum at the moment of the inception of Ethereum. So
Yes.
if you remember the history of the blockchain version 1, the Bitcoin invention, and if you think about Bitcoin is an example of a genius level of focus on total system design. Right? It was able to be instantiated in a white paper, which all at once articulated a comprehensive system design, including all the necessary elements, like really solving the Byzantine generals problem, and also thinking about the intrinsic motivational and incentive systems that would drive behaviors around miners and around consensus. Kind of all had to be done at once. If you didn't get it all at once, you weren't going to be able to discover it through local experimentation. But once you did the design work, you then began the hard problem of implementation. And then now we're in the middle of the lived vital experiment, where we discover all kinds of problems that do actually have to be solved hands-on, with, I think, a Lightning Network being the canonical example of that.
Yep.
Then what happens, though, is you explore the space of possibility that opens up within the domain of the Bitcoin approach. What you see at the edge of that space is a path that is Turing completion. And for those who remember the history, there was actually what ended up happening was a whole bunch of people who were looking at different altcoins who began trying to explore the space of possibility that lived within the design capacity of the Bitcoin style blockchain. And they ran up against the edge of Turing completeness, which was, well, we kind of need to step back and do a comprehensive redesign. We need to actually re-enter the space of pure architecture, and think about the problem in its purest sense, and really move into a design space, and think about the whole thing all at once. Think about all the different parameters, all the different elements of how they feed back on each other. Don't try to run an iterative process. Launch a new project on a completely new basis, or an importantly new basis, Ethereum, and go. Right? So you couldn't get to what Ethereum is by merely progressing organically from Bitcoin. You actually had to take Bitcoin as a hint, step back, rethink the whole thing, launch a new design approach, and bam. Right? So you kind of have these trade-offs between what we might call high design and organic development. And the DAO is of that same order. Obviously, the beginning part of this video talked about a fundamental theoretical problem, but it's many, many different things are driving that. That you cannot get to the DAO through organic development on top of the Ethereum platform. You can do some interesting things. You can build ways of doing governance. You can build ways of having collaborative economies. But the problem space is actually more fundamental than that. And so it's necessary to step back, radically expand the scope of consideration, think about the entire systems design as a whole, really do design in the way the design is supposed to be done. And then once you've actually really gotten down to, you might call conceptual clarity, what are the really important pieces? What are the fundamental elements that must be in place in the right way and how they feed back and relate to each other? Then you instantiate it as a technical architecture, as a protocol. And then once you've done that, you move back into the space of organic development. And then you're running, right? If you've got it right, you've entered into a new space, which is equivalent to these kind of major tones, Bitcoin, Ethereum. So I think that's the frame. There's a kind of approach and a style and a capacity for design thinking and for fundamental thinking. And I think thinking in a fundamental fashion that is, I believe, necessary to truly grasp the question of the DAO. And it is only when that has been done appropriately and then instantiated that we have moved into this new era. And that's, I think that's kind of the way to understand it. That if you want to understand what's going on in the DAO space, this conceptual distinction between high design and organic development, I think is helpful to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And if you draw the analogy to the organic development in the direction of Turing completeness in Bitcoin and high design in the innovation of Ethereum, I think is the analogy. If that makes sense to you, then I think you're in good shape to navigate this space. If it doesn't make sense to you, then hopefully you have other ways of making sense if you want to jump into this space, because it's not at all trivial.
Yeah, it sounds like, in your view, the rise of decentralized collaboration represents the third major movement in the evolution of blockchain.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way of thinking about it. You can think about these as major and minor tones or major and minor movements, and this is a major movement, and it would be the third major movement. And I have to admit that from an aesthetic perspective, I can't prove this, nor would I even try, but intuitively, this may in fact be the reason. Now, if you think about the magnitude of consequence of what I described is what happens when you really figure out how to build an anti-rivalrous economic architecture. If we're 100 years in the future, we look back at this story, if it turns out that we have cracked the code on anti-rivalrous, then that will have been why we did all of this in the first place.
And requires a completely bottom-up approach integrated with high-level design.
Yes. And in fact, what I would say is that if you think about the essence of what design means, really, design means simultaneously something that is fully bottoms up and fully top down.
Yep.
You have to actually be able to grasp both simultaneously and understand the synergistic consequences of relating them appropriately.
And sounds like for you, one of the geniuses of DAOstack is the attention to and facility in both bottom-up and top-down approaches to architecture and design.
Yes, the kinds of people who have been gathered around it have that capability and also have that consciousness, meaning that they are not just doing it, but they're aware of the fact that they're doing it, and in many ways why.
Yeah.
Although they are continuing to struggle to figure out how to articulate it, which is not surprising. It's hard. It's new territory.
Yeah. Anything else you want to mention while we're talking about the contribution that DAOstack might be able to make within the greater DAO ecosystem?
I could kind of pull out specific pieces. So within the concept of design, there is this. Well, actually, let me just I'll zoom in. So we'll zoom into a lower level. So how do we instantiate this notion of top down and bottom up simultaneously? Well, what you think about then is constructing an architecture that is set up in such a way that it is simultaneously modular and fundamentally open, meaning that it can go to where it needs to go, but also creates boundary conditions that make and focus people's energy and attention so that it's not a random search of the whole space. So this is, many people would just call this good architecture. But like that's a good architecture is genius. Creating something which has the capacity to be very fluid and open, modular, in many ways easy to build and construct on, but at the same time somehow has a set of intrinsic boundary conditions and initial conditions such that the right kinds of bottoms-up choices are probabilistically likely to show up and to be sensed in such a way that they reinforce each other is an act of genius. And interestingly enough, I'm not sure if this is going to be clarifying to anybody, but it's actually the kind of thing that happened in Minecraft. When Notch built Minecraft, and I think the gigantic success of Minecraft, I think, is not confusing. He was able to build something which was a sandbox, but it was a sandbox that also had the right kind of elements to cause people to actually play in the sandbox in a way that was both fun and generative.
Yeah, I was just going to make a sandbox analogy myself. It's like DAOstack is providing not so much a fixed offering in decentralized governance or a fixed set of software tools even, but rather a kind of sandbox for ongoing experimentation in decentralized governance, and as such provides the sandbox infrastructure like the sand, as well as maybe a set of initial toys and tools to play with.
The initial, it's the combination. Like if all I get, so the Sahara Desert is not a sandbox,
right?
It's a disaster. Right? It's the potential is too open. You can't do anything with it. A sandbox is something that has the ability to be extremely open and fluid, but at the same time has the right kinds of constraints, hints, and elements that actual structure will emerge on it. Which is, I mean, if anybody spends time speaking to Matan and Adam, by the way, both of whom I know reasonably well. I don't know a whole lot of the other folks as well. So if you speak to any of them, it doesn't take but a few seconds if you're paying attention to recognize that you're dealing with a kind of mind that is not, normal. And I mean that in the mathematical sense and also in the psychological sense. It's the kind of mind that one would hope is what you'd put on this kind of a project.
Yeah, great. I feel like this could be a good place to wrap. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I feel like that was actually, I felt like that was pretty good.
Yeah, I think we covered some great territory. So, Jordan, thanks a lot for your time. It was great talking with you.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.